Hi there, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. This is the YouTube History Magic show that illuminates more than 20 years of the game. This is also part 7 of my 8-part profile on Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, the first Magic sets. Why listen to my story? Because my stories are best stories. Today, we're looking at a staple of fantasy literature, artifacts, objects of power, devices collecting arcane energy, and eldritch waves. Most of them are fables or legends, with none in generations having laid eyes on them. Some can change the fate of nations. You may have heard of some of them. The One Ring of Sauron, the Lochnar, the Infinity Gauntlet, Mitt Romney's tax returns. Seriously, today we're looking at the power of craft. Artifacts started off in Alpha and are in almost every single set. Expansions from Antiquities to Mirrodin to New Phyrexia have pushed the boundaries of what artifacts can do. They can be fierce constructs fighting enemies, or gems that produce mana for their owner, or lay down energies that suppress the land itself. They may be secrets hidden in a tomb for centuries, or they may just be tools forged every day in the smithy, providing tools for combat. They might just be a sword or a shield. They can be that simple. But they can always turn the tide. Artifacts are objects of power. Some may not have been crafted by the hand of sentients, as in the case of Winter Orb, but others are definitely designed and created by the hands of powerful wizards, though they're not necessarily made by Planeswalkers, just to be clear. Artifacts are unique in that every color has access to them, although some colors profit from them more than others. The classic example is blue in Alpha, which has no real answers to dealing with something on the table except for stealing it with control magic, or bouncing it with Unsummon and then countering it, or possibly burning it off the table with Psionic Blast. Ooh, bad flavor. But any color could shut down a beatdown deck with Meekstone, supplemented by Icy Manipulator, or Niven's Disc, and that was a strategy that blue exploited for years. Green. Well, green didn't have any answers to creatures in ABU, just getting bigger ones. And in case it did have to destroy everything, well, Niven's Disc was an answer. Anyone could use Niven's Disc, and it was a major exploit of early Magic that people did not put too much on the table at the time. I think it's important to understand that artifacts are some of the hardest cards for early players to understand. They're all over the map in terms of what they do, and more importantly, they functioned in fundamentally different ways. So we have to get into that. Let's start off with the most popular group game artifact, Howling Mine. I've seen tons of Howling Mines in casual multiplayer, EDH, and cubes. Howling Mine was a huge attraction for many players. And hey, the appeal is obvious. Howling Mine is a proposition that you, its controller, will be able to use the extra cards you draw in a way that is much more advantageous than the extra stuff that your opponent draws. This is very much a blue effect, and most non-artifacts that have this ability are in blue. Dictative Crewfix is the flavor du jour as of the production of this video. Now, the problem with Howling Mine is that it is a continuous artifact. And that means I have to explain all that extra text in that typeline. The original rules for Magic about artifacts were a pain. There were 4 types. Artifact creatures follow the same rules you know and love today. They have both the card type creature and artifact. Mono artifacts are artifacts that you tap to play an ability. They may also have a mana cost. Now, mono artifacts didn't have the tap symbol because the tap symbol was introduced in 4th edition. Before the tap symbol, Revise had the tilted T symbol. Anyway, by saying that it's mono, you knew that you could tap them. Poly artifacts were artifacts that had activated abilities that didn't involve tapping. Circles of Protection were enchantments you can use again and again. Soul Net triggers every time that a creature dies, but you don't have to tap these things to activate them, you just have to pay mana. Thus, poly artifacts. And then there are continuous artifacts. These are effects that are constant on the table. Black Vice is continuous artifact. So is Gauntlet of Might, or Meekstone, or Winter Orb. Continuous artifacts have the rules text that you know and love. If Howling Mine is in play, everyone draws an additional card during their draw step. Simple, right? Hold it! As a continuous artifact, the effect lasts only so long as the artifact is in play and is untapped. Yeah, the ability to tap the artifact originally would shut off the ability. So if you had Icy Manipulator, a very powerful uncommon artifact that control players adored, that means adored, you could draw 2 cards off of Howling Mine, and then during your main phase, you could tap the Howling Mine. So if there were 3 other players at the table, you'd be stiffing them out of a card. This would harbor resentment, but hey, players gotta play. Drawing a card ahead of other people was an irritant, but most players got over it. When you're playing Winter Orb, well, that's a different story. So here was a problem Wizards had to deal with. There's a lot of rules baggage here. Wizards eventually found a better way to clarify how artifacts work by adding the tap symbol to cards. So we could get rid of mono artifacts and just have artifacts. Using the mana cost and the colon, oh, the lovely colon, simplified our poly artifacts. Continuous artifacts just became artifacts. And the bit about turning them off by tapping them went away. Artifact creatures were still creatures as well as artifacts, so they were the first cards printed to have 2 types. But we're going to get back to them. Magic reduced the different types of artifacts, so we ended up with Howling Mines that looked like this. Here's how Magic players ended up changing Howling Mine. Lots of people loved playing the cards with the old functionality, and there were quite a few artifacts that wanted that functionality. Howling Mine was ragingly popular, and lots of old-timers wanted to go back to the old rules, where they could decide who got extra cards and who didn't. Under 5th edition rules, Wizards said no, and said that the continuous artifacts had to get in line in the world where being tapped didn't matter. I mean, from a modern perspective, why would you care about, say, tapping a Planeswalker? Wizards wanted tapped or not tapped to be irrelevant with artifacts. But letter-writing campaigns, massive arguments on Usenet, and impassioned pleas at the Pro Tour convinced Wizards to add extra text to Howling Mine. Howling Mine was so popular, it had to be in the core sets, and so they added and kept this extra text on it. Other artifacts, such as Meekstone, didn't get that turn-off clause. So, in '93, cards that allowed you to tap permanents, such as Twiddle, played a significantly larger role in the metagame than they do today. Twiddle was a common that Wizards tried to push on the public to stress how fundamentally wild the game's play could be just by tapping or untapping something. Wizards printed a 4-page article on the role of Twiddle in Duelist No. 6. Now, how relevant is a Twiddle in today's game, which is much more about creatures? Not so much. You know, that's just a great question. But let's get back to the artifacts. ABU's artifacts also provided mana acceleration for every color. Yeah, we're talking about this now. The famous Mox cycle came into play for 0 mana, and tapped for 1 colored mana instantaneously. Mox comes from Moxie, an old-fashioned cola that was popular on the East Coast. Supplementing the Moxim were Black Lotus, the most powerful accelerants of them all, Sol Ring, Basalt Monolith, and Mana Vault. These artifacts broke the mana system, the basic structure of Magic that rations players' abilities to play powerful spells. With a Sol Ring on turn 1, players could play powerful 4-drops like Juggernaut on turn 2. Wizards quickly realized that violating the integrity of the mana system was a considerable mistake, and chose not to reprint the Moxen in Revised Edition. Basalt Monolith, Mana Vault, and Sol Ring got a short reprieve, but still got removed from 4th edition. Wizards had learned their lesson, or so they thought. Fast artifact mana was not healthy for the game. Later attempts such as Mirage's Diamonds and Tempest's Medallions tried to replace the Moxes with varying levels of success. Over the years, many artifact accelerants have seen print. So let's talk about 3-colored mana. Black Lotus has seen a few copycats, all of which had success in tournaments. Lion's Eye Diamond required players to pitch their hand to cast a spell, but tricks such as Yawgmoth's Will made it a key component in vintage Storm decks. Lotus Bloom made its caster wait 3 turns to hit play, but was a major component of the Time Spiral Legal Dragonstorm combo deck that won Makihito Mihara a world championship. Gilded Lotus has seen play in some Omniscience combo decks. I'm not going to talk about how much the Moxen and Black Lotus cost today, because the vintage market shifts so rapidly. This review has deliberately chosen to avoid discussing financial costs of these cards, but if you really would like to do some research on what they cost now, go ahead and do that by using TCG Player or Star City Games or whatever website you want. Suffice to say, they're stupidly expensive. Basalt Monolith, which I want to say Monolith, is essentially a bank. Pay 3 now, get 3 later when you need it. This card got significantly worse when they decided to restrict the window for untapping it to the beginning of its controller's upkeep. This was a relevant component of most X-Spell decks. Backing it up in many cubes is Mana Vault. Mana Vault is like Basalt Monolith, except the initial loan only requires 1 mana. This allowed white to play a Serra Angel on turn 2. I mean, that's ridiculous. And with cube technology like Trinket Mage, the Vault is tutorable. Like our fine characters in the Triads, or Yakuza, or Mafia, or Russian Mafia, or whatever your local organized crime syndicate is, though, the Mana Vault requires kickbacks in life. The one-shot to mana was so relevant, though, most people didn't mind. Basalt Monolith and Mana Vault later inspired Urza's Legacy's Grim Monolith, part of the most broken standard ever. Now, to be honest, I'm not a fan of these cards, though I do like cards that make less mana than the original investment, like Everflowing Chalice. The Moxen were obviously broken, and the banks turned out to be too good as well. ABU had some powerful artifacts that dealt damage to players. Ankh of Mishra was a powerful symmetrical artifact that did damage every time players made a land drop. This spell was perfectly tailored for weenie decks, which didn't need so many lands and just wanted to get some more damage in. While Ankh took a while to make an impact, as ABU had too few small creatures and not enough pump spells to make weenie aggro viable, it did become popular with the release of Antiquities and Atog Rush decks. The only card that I think that punished players for playing lands later on is Zozu the Punisher, which is far less effective because you couldn't have multiple copies of Zozu out. Black Vice was another damage dealer that hit the table on turn 1, or on rare occasion, 2 of them, thanks to Sol Ring. That meant that an opponent took 6 damage before they even drew a card. Now, this was made a little better by Artifact Mana, which came out quickly, allowing players to empty their hands, but many decks, particularly blue ones, just couldn't deal with this 1-drop. This nasty little artifact inspired many variants, such as Ivory Tower and the Rack from Antiquities. Black Vice also comboed especially well with Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune. Oh, we're back up to 7, you say? How convenient! Early counter magic decks loathed Black Vice because after an opponent played it on turn 1, most likely dodging counter magic, they often sat back and did nothing for the rest of the game. And with no way of getting rid of the counter spells in hand, the Blue Mage was doomed. Another artifact that damaged players was Copper Tablet. This symmetrical effect pinged both players every upkeep. While most players initially thought this effect was miserable, aggro decks have found it very useful. Other decks tried to alleviate the pain by running Samite Healers or Life Gain. Now, there's so many permanents that damage both players on a regular basis, but unlike so many ABU cards, I'm not sure if Copper Tablet was a major influence on them. Would you like to see the worst card ever restricted? Dingus Egg, an artifact that deals 2 damage to a player if one of their lands is destroyed, was actually restricted by the Duelist Convocation in their first restricted list in 1994 as an attempt to discourage players from playing land destruction decks. This was a horrible mistake, since the whole point of land destruction decks is not to deal damage in the process of destroying lands, but to play a creature or creatures that can get damage in while removing the opponent's ability to deal with these threats, riding them to victory. The legacy of Dingus Egg doesn't actually live in artifacts, but in spells that destroy lands and deal damage. Mirrodin's Molten Rain and Mirage's Choking Sands are a fine example of how Wizards put chocolate in its peanut butter. Though to be honest, I hate chocolate and peanut butter together. The original color fixer, Celestial Prism, is also one of the very worst. I much prefer Prismatic Lens, which fixes mana or taps for 1. There are more variants on this ability than I can shake a rod of ruin at, but it's important to see how conservatively Garfield went with this. It seems paradoxical, given the high availability of dual lands in the set. And now, let's talk about the Magic card that has inspired the most urban myths. Chaos Orb was one of only 2 dexterity cards in Magic, cards that required the player to use physical actions to change gameplay. When Chaos Orb got played, the ruling was that players could not rearrange cards on the table and could only move them in order to tap or untap them. Stories before this ruling told of players moving their cards all over the table with a foot or more between them so as to make the orb impossible to hit more than one card. The most famous urban legend that people talk about in all of Magic, that has never quite been confirmed to the best of my knowledge, is that a player cut up his copy of Chaos Orb with a pair of scissors to tiny little pieces as he activated it, then sprinkled the remnants all over the opponent's board in order to win. This legend led to the infamous unglued card Chaos Confetti, which allowed players to recreate this mythic event. Here, I'll demonstrate. With a chopped up basic land. Using Chaos Orb rules. 5 feet away is BS.
Alright, here is just a little bit of view. Chaos Confetti. Okay, go. Haha! Oh my god, you did it all at once. Where are you? Alright, so it looks like we've got the dead is Hornet Queen, very dead. Courser of Crufix, dead. All these tokens are dead, and 2 lands are dead.
Wizards quickly banned Chaos Orb, as well as its Legends counterpart Falling Star, because arbitrating physical gestures was a problematic issue. In some formats, such as 5-color, Chaos Orb just straight up destroyed the permanent when activated. But it's much more of a casual card for great storytelling fun. Good luck getting one, or letting your friends let you proxy one. Do not ask me how this card works with sleeves. That would make me angry. You would not like me when I'm angry. Mark Rosewater claimed that when Beta was out, the card around him that everybody wanted was Clockwork Beast. Clockwork Beast hit play as a 7/4 and wound down its power over time. Today, nobody would play it. But the fact was that this was an immensely powerful creature that any deck could play, because no matter what colors you had, it could still swing for a ton. I find that a little risible, since it dies to Disenchant, a card that was played by many people, but fair enough. There were many Clockwork creatures printed over the years. My favorite is Clockwork Dragon, because you can wind it up at any time, not just on your upkeep. Also, Dragon? Clockwork Beast could take down a wall of ice. Those walls of stone kept it out. Another artifact creature that proved popular in the early days of Magic was Obsidianus Golem. Caption guy, tell them what people called it. Thank you. Magic players liked lowbrow humor then as much as they do today. But seriously, a 4/6 for 6 mana seems horribly inefficient by modern standards. And yet it was a massive improvement over some of the 6-drops available for some colors. It may have had 2 less power than Personal Incarnation, but at least the Golem didn't die to terror and didn't cost you half your life. If you were a new player with a very limited card pool, this guy was exciting because you could put it in any deck and it could trade with Crawworm, another 6-drop that terrorized people. A card that I've always kept in my queue, because I enjoy seeing reactions from people, is Living Wall. Its 0/6 stats are a little underpowered as walls go, but the regeneration element was nice. The most memorable element of Living Wall was its art, which featured the grotesque collection of flesh, in the middle of which there was a fetus. This got pulled in 4th edition due to some people getting offended by the art. The most efficient artifact creature in ABU is the Juggernaut. Don't you know what that is? Well, the Juggernaut is a 5/3 for 4 mana, 2 entire power more than a Hill Giant, and it can't be blocked by walls. And that was a very relevant ability in Alpha. Juggernaut has seen print quite often, and has many variants such as Otarian Juggernaut, Phyrexian Juggernaut, and this guy. Oh, wait. No, Kane Marco predates this. Darn it. Jade Statue is a far less efficient creature, an artifact that can turn into a creature for 2 mana. being a 3/6. Now, the card has printed power and toughness, but is not, by default, a creature. This makes it anomalous. When we look at Saga Block's sleeping enchantments, like Opal Gargoyle, they don't have power toughness numbers on them. Closest analogs to Jade Statue today are, surprisingly, the Gods of Theros. Like Jade Statue, they usually don't come into play as a creature. Unlike Jade Statue, they are considered to be creatures while in their owner's hand. Jade Statue confused many players when it was released, one reason why it was booted from the game with Revised. The 9th edition templating put Jade Statue in its proper template, though. Damage prevention used to be more commonly printed in the past than it is now, because the damage prevention rules were a big part of the original game, and Garfield wanted to teach people how the system worked. So we had cards with an ability designed to teach you about how an ability worked, forcing players to learn arcane rules. It's a bit of a circular argument. Someday I'll have to do a special on pre-6th edition rules. Anyway, Conservator sucked, and was remarkably inefficient. A 7-mana investment to prevent 2 damage? No thank you. The alternative was Force Field, a 3-mana artifact that prevented all but 1 damage from an unblocked creature. This was a neat concept, but against, say, Hypnotic Spectre, this wasn't going to help. Conservator teaches us how Wizards used to look at rules in the past, and how it looks at rules today. In the past, it had lots of cards that used rules that weren't easily understood. So people would learn how to use those rules since they came up so frequently. Nowadays, when Wizards wants to make complex rules, they shift them to uncommon or rare so that players don't have to encounter them that much. It's a question of fun. If you ask me, the best way of preventing creature damage is Meekstone. Meekstone is incredibly powerful, preventing all creatures with power 3 or more from untapping. It didn't work well against Goblin or Merfolk decks, but it did shut down green decks and flyers handily. This most commonly got played in white decks along with Sarah Angel. The question was, should you play Meekstone or Crusade, which ended up keeping your Savannah Lions and White Knights from working? Well, that was a tough call. I know it seems horrible by today's standards, but Jayemdae Tomb was a total bomb in early Magic. This was the only way to draw additional cards outside of blue. The investment cost was steep, but this card was pioneering in controlling lock decks like Weissman's The Deck to gain card advantage. Now, Jayemdae Tomb was named after James Michael Davis, an early pen collaborator. In fact, all of the early books of Magic, Jalem Tomb, Book of MSE, and so on, are named after designers. These cards fall into a category, vanity cards. Someday, I wouldn't mind being featured on a vanity card as some kind of Magic historian. Huh? Think about it, Wizards. Please? The real secret to getting onto a Magic card as part of the art is knowing an artist, though. So I don't have my hopes up. The converse of Jayemdae Tomb is Disrupting Scepter. Now, I personally much prefer the 7th edition art because you get to see the card in action bonking people on the head. And that's exactly what the Scepter does. Richard Garfield was smart to keep this card from being activated on their opponent's turn, giving players a window to use the card that they just drew. This was a critical element of many early discard decks. Jayemdae Tomb may have cost 1 more to play as well as activate, but at least its controller could use it at the end of their opponent's turn. Card draw is blue, discard is black, and doing 1 damage to a creature? Well, it's more red than other colors by today's rubrics, but with Prodigal Sorcerer and Pirate Ship and ABU, we thought of it as blue back in the day. Rod of Ruin was preposterously expensive, costing 7 damage for the initial use, and 3 more past that. But hey, at least you couldn't kill it with other Tims, and it did kill Tim himself. Crystal Rod is one of the artifact cycles offering something for every color. These artifacts triggered every time a player played a spell of a specific color, letting the Crystal Rod's controller gain 1 life. These were called the Lucky Charms, though I don't see the connection to any kind of cereal. When the sideboard rule became implemented in late 1993, players went immediately to these, thinking that, hey, they can gain life advantage, especially in the mirror match. And while that was true for the case of Iron Star, the other charms just paled in comparison. Another life gain artifact, Soulnet, let you gain life every single time a creature died, though Soulnet did require you to pay up for each spirit caught. The thing that frustrated early players is that every time there was a trigger, you got nothing if you didn't have a single mana open. Coming up short when opponents played stuff became quite frustrating. Wizards addressed this by fixing them with 9th edition with a 2 mana initial cost and free activation. The newest incarnation is Magic 2014 Staff Cycle, which costs 3, but triggered on your playing basic lands as well as colors of the appropriate type. But didn't track your opponent's spells. In Mono Red Mirrors, Dragon's Claw was a huge life swing in the mirror match. Staff of the Flame Magus didn't have anything close to the same impact. Stupid Lucky Charms, you're magically pathetic. Cyclopean Tomb and Cormus Bell are a fascinating duo. One turns lands into swamps, and the other makes swamps 1/1s. Theoretically, black players could use Pestilence to kill all the enemy's transformed swamps. But there's a problem with that game plan. I think you're going to be able to figure it out. Cyclopean Tomb's closest descendant is Mirrodin's Quicksilver Fountain, an artifact that floods lands, transforming them into islands. Cormus Bell ended up teaching players some very interesting rules, such as the fact that animated lands suffered from summoning sickness, but most of the time black players were inconvenienced by it showing up. Green land animation spells have taken over Cormus Bell's space on the color pie from black. Green already had a stake with living lands, but later sets clinched Green's dominance in this area. Helm of Chatsuk. Okay, we have a card that can give a creature banding. Fantastic! I've said my piece about banding in the ABU White video, and I don't really care to revisit it further. Again, this does fit the theme of ABU that Magic cards can have anything happen to them, whether it's taking away flying, adding banding, or pumping stats for the short term or long term. I've already discussed Gauntlet of Might in my Red review. Really, it's just an extra red card in the set, but it's a really important extra red card. Many early Control players played Glasses of Urza as a tool to figure out when to play their removal spells or counter magic. Over time, Wizards decided to keep this tool out of the other colors and just push it into blue with spells like Ataxian Probe, Telepathy, and Peek. Its hippie partner, Sunglasses of Urza, is an extremely narrow card, used to make red-white decks more viable, or as a countermeasure for red decks facing Conversion. Oh my god, Conversion was a beating. Library of Leng allows players to do something crazy, allowing you to discard spells to the top of your library instead of the graveyard. This allowed players to keep their plans intact even if their hand gets wrecked, and yet it still didn't defang discard's power. This card hasn't seen reprint since 5th edition because the effect just didn't do enough to impact most games. Oh, how could I forget? Like Reliquary Tower, Library of Leng also lets you have as many cards in your hand as you want. That's something. Illusionary Mask is a very influential card in Magic. With this in play, you can summon cards upside down. The scary thing about it is that Illusionary Mask lets your controller ignore comes into play triggers. So if you want to cast Phyrexian Dreadnought for 1 mana, a 12/12 Trampler, this is going to let you do it without that initial cost. The same goes for Eater of Days, a 9/8 Trampling Flyer. But when you use this card, you have to track the mana cost that was paid and made sure that when the creature becomes relevant by becoming target, destroyed, attacked, blocked, or getting modified in any way, it turned over and it was played legally. If it was not appropriately marked, oh, judge. That hot pile of bureaucracy meant that Illusionary Mask was never going to stay in the game for that long. Illusionary Mask also inspired the Morph mechanic, which has seen print in 3 different blocks, so it has given us a major legacy. Jade Monolith's ability to redirect damage from one of your creatures to yourself can swing the flow of many combats, and also replicates the particular ability of Personal Incarnation, allowing players to take a short-term hit for profit in the long run. But with 4 mana, the initial investment kept us from making any waves at tournaments. It astonishes me that Icy Manipulator wasn't uncommon and found itself on 1994's first restricted list, but there it was. Old Icy was an absolute staple of most decks, being able to tap down an opponent's big threat every turn. Or if your opponent only had 1 land of a specific type, you could shut off that color on their upkeep. It was a natural ally of Royal Assassin and Netsling Imp, so it got played most frequently in black decks at first, but it was also extremely popular in control builds in general. If your opponent has a serious threat, just tap it down. Then when the opponent overextends, hit him with a Wrath of God, or a Hurricane, or Earthquake, or whatever the appropriate sweeper would be. Since then, Icy Manipulator has been reprinted quite a few times, first in Ice Age where it got some ugly arts, then in later sets like Mirrodin and other core sets. Tapping down creatures has been a staple of white, with cards like Master Decoy, though blue gets a stab at it too here and there. Blue can tap stuff as well as spells, as in the case of Twiddle. But the best homage to Icy was Urza's Legacy's Ring of Gix, which reduced the cost by 1, but tacked on Echo. And I was super pumped to be playing this at the Urza's Legacy pre-release. It was the ideal tool for a player who wants to control the board. The favorite time I liked playing Icy Manipulator was when I had a Royal Assassin and my opponent control magicked another one, so I was able to tap mine, well, the control magicked one, so that I could ship it with my own. Many old-timers will have their own Icy stories. Magic has produced so many token producers that I can't name them all, but it all started with The Hive. The Hive, yeah, it requires the definite article. The Hive cost 5 to play, 5 to activate, and spat out a 1/1 Flying Wasp. Yeah, 10 mana. Ugh. But the Hive was sought after by most players because it could go into any deck until they managed to try it in a tournament setting and saw how effective it truly was. But at the kitchen table, the Hive was a good combination with Lord of the Pit, feeding it on demand. I saw this particular combination in casual games quite a few times. Time Vault has had many different wordings over time, because Wizards for many years did not want to have players go into infinite turns just by untapping Time Vault. It seemed so unfair. It was so unfair. After many years, eventually they just gave up and said, fine, original wording counts. This turned into Tezzeret, the Seeker, being an almost complete lock for infinite turns in Vintage, though Tezzeret was also able to untap that vault with its possibility, in addition to searching the damn thing out. Now, the only way to untap Time Vault originally was with Twiddle, but over time, the methods of getting this untapped exploded in number, from Mind Over Matter to Voltaic Key. One attempt to fix this card was Magosi the Veil, which was just a land and didn't have many ways to slip counters on it. I've spent a fair amount of time explaining about how artifacts broke the rules of mana production, but there's one more I need to talk about, Winter Orb. Winter Orb is a cruel, cruel card. It allowed players to untap only one land on their turn. Now, if you had Icy Manipulator out, you could tap it after their upkeep, and then untap all your lands, and then the Winter Orb. With more than one Icy Manipulator out, this was the first prison deck. Decks that won by getting a single threat out and then keeping opponents from doing anything else for the rest of the game. And I literally mean they did nothing. It was brutal. It left people quitting the game out of outrage, and it's the reason why they restricted Icy Manipulator? Okay, Wizards, sometimes you do strange things. Note that while Howling Mine got the trinket texts and layered printings that meant that you could tap it to shut it off, Winter Orb and Meekstone got no such thing. Before I finish up, I just need to mention those paragons of mana flexibility, the dual lands. The original dual lands were very simple, and most players were able to get them handily. 3 or 4 color decks were fairly common throughout the time that Revise was in print. Why did Wizards let these see print? Well, cards like Tsunami and Flashfires existed. Landwalk was fairly frequent, so Bog Wraith, Sea Serpent, and Goblin King's buddies could punish players for playing the field. But soon enough, Wizards figured out why it was a bad idea to let lands exist that were almost strictly better than basic lands. When Blood Moon from the Dark saw print, budget players claimed justice. The prices for original dual lands have skyrocketed in recent years as of this video's filming. Synergies with Onslaught and Zendikar's fetch lands allow formats like Legacy and Vintage to have mana bases that other formats can only gaze at and weep out of envy and jealousy. It was important that Wizards printed the original dual lands because Wizards saw that players could abuse them and could try any color combination. But dual lands were another factor that made green the laughingstock of the 5 colors, because players would splash green for Birds of Paradise and nothing else. If you really think I'm going to talk about all the non-basics that were inspired by the original dual lands today, I'm not doing that today. I'd be here for another hour. I mean, I do enjoy talking about this stuff, but wow, there's so much to do. That brings our show to a close. Now you know where artifacts and non-basic lands started, and in the future we're going to see in so much more detail how they developed over time. I hope you learned a lot and enjoyed the show. I loved making it. So we've examined the set up close and personal, and next time, to finish off the series, we're shifting gears and looking at the larger picture. What were the big lessons learned from the set? What were the lasting impacts to the color pie? And what were the flashes in the pan? All will be revealed in the next episode, the ABU wrap-up. So please go back and check out my other videos, not just my ABU ones, but all those other set reviews as well. It would be a favor to me if you subscribed and shared this video, and also hit that like button. And I would love to hear your comments. Your input will make the stories even richer. Thanks for watching. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games and good luck.